Hey everyone, I'm back, and today we are going to get back into dating sim, um, volume three. So yeah, um, volume three. Volume three starts off with Leon. More or less, he's been getting popular. He's now receiving a whole bunch of letters from females, more or less to for him to invite them to the tea parties. Um, Now, even though he's getting popular, it's not in the way that he wants it to, in the way that he wants to be popular. More or less because he has now become a lower fourth rank noble. Um, that's the only reason why that he's receiving these letters. Everybody still more or less doesn't like him. Um, they just after his status now, so that's what the girls are after. So Leon's just like whatever. He wishes that there were better girls out there. Um, so he just was like whatever. So it cuts off to um, Carla. If you remember what she did from the last volume with the whole pirates and whatnot, she's more or less been cut off from her family and she was left at the academy. More or less as an example, everybody who had dealings with the whole pirate thing, more or less they got their nobility taken away and whatnot. But seeing as how it was Carla and not her family, they just cut her off. So now she's at the academy. Um, she's being looked down on and everything. She's, everybody's treating her bad because of what happened, what she did. So here comes Marie, who's she's being put in a higher power now because now that she's more or less the saint, her status has gone up. So now she has a bunch of followers, and she sees Carla, and she ends up, you know, in a way befriending Carla, telling everybody, she was partying and whatever. There's no reason to treat her bad, whatever. But for Marie, the reason why she was doing this was just to piss off Leon. She figured since Carla was, involved in what happened, having Carla on her side would just piss off Leon. So that's why she did that. So, you know, we move on to the next chapter, more or less. Um, Leon and his group, Leon, Angelica, Olivia, and Marie and her group, minus three of the prince, well, the prince, minus the prince, Julius, Chris, and Brad. They more or less went to the elf village. They heard that there was some ruins over there, so Leon ended up becoming Marie's guard, more or less. So he had to go around wherever Marie went and guard her because um, it more or less because she became the saint, they was looking for somebody who could guard her. So they did set it up where any guy could volunteer for that, but they more or less put Leon in that position because he's more or less built himself up. So they ended up going to the Elf Village. In Marie's group, it was Marie, Kyle, Carla, Jilk, and Greg. And like I said, in Leon's group, it was him, Olivia, Angelica, and his two friends. So they more or less went to the elf village. We find out that's where Kyle being Marie's servant, that's where he's from. Um, and when they get there, he ends up meeting his mother, Eumeria. Now we end up finding out that Kyle is a half elf. Now the thing about it is supposedly elves aren't and humans aren't supposed to be able to produce children. However, there is a very small chance that it can happen. So it happened with Eumeria. Um, we find out a little later that what happened was she left the village and she got taken in by a noble. Um, She ended up getting pregnant with the child, but then she got kicked out and she came back to the elf village. Now, Emeria, um, more or less in the village, they don't really care for her. They treat her really badly. And the thing with Kyle is he hated the village because of all of that. But you know, they go into the village. They ended up meeting with the village head, and they more or less tell the village head that they're here for to explore the ruins. Now, the village head more or less tells them that they can't do it, but then somebody who's above the village head, she's been there for a long time. She more or less comes in and she does fortunes. Now, she tells them that they're they can go to the ruins, but only certain few whatever. So they go there and there's nothing in the ruins. Everything's been cleared out. So they figured, it was just a waste of time, whatever. But Marie, after everything, being that she has to take care of, her group is getting bigger more or less. It's now her, the prince, and the other four. So that's six already. Then there's Kyle and Carla. So there's eight of them together now. So her group is just getting bigger, but they have no money, and it's eight of them. So she was excited for the whole, treasure hunt that they was doing, but they ended up not being anything. So in a panic, she ends up running deeper into the ruins, but Leon ends up chasing after her. Now he chases after her with a gun. In Leon's mind, he's like, okay, now it's finally time. Um, I've got her alone, and I can finally question her and ask her like, what the hell is she doing? Why is she derailing the game? And learn about her, being somebody who also reincarnated. So he runs after her and he tells everybody to just stay right there. Now, as he runs after her, he catches up to her and he points the gun at her. Now, he starts threatening her and asking her questions. In doing so, after a while, you know, it almost came out about who she was, but something happened. There was a little earthquake and the floor ended up falling in. So Leon and her ended up falling further into the ruins. Now, when they fell into the ruins, oh, one more person I forgot to mention that also was also with them in their group that went to the elf village was Gertrude. Gertrude being the princess of the Thanos kingdom that they caught in the previous volume. Um, Gertrude more or less she's with them because they decided to more or less have her on as like she's there studying abroad, but we'll get back to her. So yeah, Leon and Marie ended up falling into the hole further into the ruins, and everybody else got worried because they realized Leon ended up chasing after her with a gun. So they thought Leon was gonna end, being that there was nothing there, why would he need a gun? So they thought that he was gonna hurt Marie. So that happened, and then when they got to where they were, where the hole was, they ended up hearing gunshots. But it was what happened was when they fell down into the hole, Leon and Marie, um, there was a whole bunch of these like beast type creatures. But the thing is, they weren't like monsters because the monsters in that world, when you kill them, they turn into like black particles. These monsters, however, when Leon shot them and killed them and whatever, the bodies still stayed. So they figured something was up with that. So now we cut back to the elf village leader, and um, after the hole opened up, they the ones that were left behind in the group, they decided that they had to go back and tell the leader, of the elf village what happened and that they need help to rescue Leon and Marie. So the village elder, he ended up running to where Leon and Marie was, but there was a reason for that. What happened was underneath the ruins, they had a bunch of elves experimenting on humans because they figured, the elves predated the humans, but what happened was the ruins was actually one of the facilities like where Luxion was. So um, in truth, Luxion came out, from the shadows because he's always shadowing Leon in like a cloak, being cloaked, so nobody could see him. So he came out and he explained that humans created the elves, so they couldn't believe it. But um, the facility that they was in ended up being powered back on, and it went further into explaining what the elves were, and that they were more or less created by the humans, and that they were made with longevity and whatnot, so that they can fight in wars. So the elder comes in, and he is actually part of that group that's gathering humans and experimenting on them and creating those monsters. So he ends up threatening Leon and whatnot, but Leon is able to easily get out of that situation. So you know they more or less get out of that situation, and they end up meeting another AI who more or less later on becomes another orb like Lexion, who hangs around and who stays around Angelica and Olivia to protect them. Um, the AI's name is Claire. That's what they named it. But it decides to more or less self-destruct because they lost the war so many years ago, and there's no reason for the facility and whatnot. So it self-destructs, and it leaves Luxion um, one little thing. That thing being a lost item, but it's a dangerous lost item. So after everything is settled, they end up leaving the elf village. They take Eumeria with them. She ends up being employed by Leon, and Leon sends her back to his house to more or less take care of everything over there, since he's not around on um his area property planet thing. So he sends her over there to take care of everything, housework and stuff like that. So on their way back, Gertrude more or less goes to Leon, and she asks if she can get the item that he got from the ruins. Being seeing as how nobody really understands what the item is, but she does. Um, what happens is that lost item is like a piece of an armor fragment, um, and she wanted to get it to send it back to her kingdom. But what happens is, because of what it was, Leon didn't really know what it was, but he knew it was dangerous, so he destroyed it. Luxion destroyed it more or less. He was um, mad at Claire for dumping that on him, so he destroyed it, and Leon ended up telling her he lost it, so she can't have it. So anyway, more or less, things is going on. They go back to school, whatever, and there's a whole plot going on in the background with um, a Marquise Frampton. More or less, he's setting things up with Gertrude behind the scenes so that they can overthrow the kingdom and that he could step up into power. So more or less, he'd let them come into the country, destroy everything, and then he'd come in and stop them, and then they'll set everything up where becomes a leader and everything. So after all that's going on, they end up framing Leon, using Mioler being his sister Jenna's servant. So they used him to plant some letters and things in Leon's room that would more or less make him look like he was helping the Thanos Empire, sending them information and whatnot. So they end up coming into the school and they take Leon and they start beating him and whatnot. So more or less they would have killed him, but the palace and everything stepped in and they ended up taking Leon and putting him in the dungeon. That's the best way they could think of for now to protect Leon from the Marquise and his people. So Leon's now in jail. Um, Olivia and Angelica find out about it. They know that Leon didn't do this, that he was framed. So more or less, Angelica goes to her family to try and get them to get Leon out, but because he was taken into custody, they more or less took his armor and his ship. So Angelica's father made it look like that he wasn't supporting Leon no more because Leon had no power, but actually everybody on Leon's side had already set certain things into motion. They purposely put Leon in the dungeon in the castle more or less to protect him. So they didn't let Angelica in on it. But also at this time, Angelica had already started realizing that she had fallen for Leon. So now Angelica heads back to the school to meet up with Olivia to let her know what had happened. So now Leon here is in the jail in the prison, and keeps getting visited by the prince and everybody else. So wait, before I get to that, Angelica goes back to the school to meet Olivia. Now Olivia is more or less, she's like she'll do whatever she has to do to get Leon out. So Angelica's like she's right there with her. So they end up going to Marie. Marie being like the highest person that they can think of, being that she's the saint. So they ask Marie to help them to get Leon out of jail. So Marie ends up telling them to prostrate themselves, get on their knees and beg and whatnot. Not thinking that they would actually do it. She said she more or less expected Olivia to, but Angelica being a duke's daughter, she figured she would never do it. So she wanted them both to do it, but seeing as how she thought only Olivia would do it, that there was no problems. But Angelica ended up getting on her knees anyway and begging. So it put her in a certain spot because now everybody they did this outside and everybody sees what's going on. So Marie starts panicking because she realizes if Leon finds out that she did this, she's in trouble. So she ends up leaving it to the prince and his friends to try and get Leon out of jail. So, like I said, we get back to the jail. Leon's in jail, and he keeps being visited by the prince and the other four. So they keep coming, trying to break him out, and it's not working because they're idiots. Everything they do, more or less, they keep going to their family, not realizing that their family has more or less cut them off. Yeah, they some of them have come back and reaccepted them as their heirs, but they're stupid. So everything that they do just makes things worse. So more or less, after some time, the Marquis and his people actually ends up coming to execute Leon in the prison cell. So Leon ends up getting away with the help of the prince and his friends, and more or less things start getting set in motion. They find out who's behind everything and whatnot. So um, Leon finds out that at this part that he needs a certain chip, which being something that was from the game. But the only way he can get to it is if he has a certain status, commander in chief. So after everything's set up, and he asks the queen, because at this point he didn't have enough status, even though he was a lower fourth noble. Um, the only people he had on his side was the king, the queen, the marquis, not marquis, sorry, the duke, Angelica's people, Clarice and her people, just a few nobles. So more or less, they had a whole meeting about what they could do, and the ship came up being that one of the few things that they could use against um, the principality. Being that at this point in the story, the principality did in fact start coming into their territory and starting a whole bunch of fights and stuff with like the outside nobles that's on the border. So things were going bad, and the whole capital, everything. They more or less went to war at this point. Um, Now the ship that I was talking about, that was something that was in the story of the game, and it was needed for later on in the game, which was more or less what was happening right at this point, because everything was sped up because of what Marie did. So they need the ship, and Leon, he didn't have enough authority to get to the ship, so he had to go to the queen to ask her to promote him, more or less, to commander in chief of the whole army. She ended up doing this after talking with Leon, making sure and confirming that if he did indeed get the ship, that he'd be able to push the principality out of their territory. So she made him commander in chief with the king, and there was one problem with the ship. It it doesn't actually respond to. It needs two people, but it's hard to start it up because it more or less the two people that it needed, they had to truly be in love with each other. It had this thing where it measured the love. So the king and queen more or less demonstrated it to everybody, and they had a problem with the ship, even though the ship was made for that. The king and queen don't have any love for each other. The queen loves the king slightly more, but their numbers were pretty low. The king only had like a 25 affection rate for the queen, and the queen had something like a 52 for the king. So we find out their relationship is pretty crap. King doesn't love her. In fact, the king loves his concubines more than he loves the actual queen. um, so now, well, after this happened and everything with Leon becoming commander in chief, he asked him to also break out Marie because what had happened was Marie was sent to the front lines already as the saint. Now, she more or less things went down, the fight happened, they failed, and she got so scared she ended up admitting in front of everybody that she's not the real saint. So they ended up jailing her now. So one of the things that Leon needed was he told them to get Marie out of jail, and he needed the ship. So he got Marie out. For now, she was set to be executed more or less because of being fake, and she tricked everybody. So they ended up the prince and his group ended up dragging Marie up to the ship because more or less at this point Marie had told all of them off. She was after everything that happened, she told them how much she didn't care for them and whatnot. She told it to them. She told it to Kyle. She told it to Carla. Everything like everything that's more or less been going on. She was trying to push them away more or less. So the prince and his group ends up dragging her onto the ship to measure how their feelings for each other. Now Marie was more or less at the bottom for all five of them, whereas all five of them hit like 90 or higher. They all was just taken by Marie. So they more or less declared that they'd get Marie to fall in love with them. Um, so now Leon's making fun of everybody. See now much everybody doesn't really like each other. So Angelica and Olivia decide to drag him up. Now it's his turn. As it, everybody's pushing Leon to get up. But before he can get on, Olivia and Angelica ended up standing on the opposite ends. And what happened is Olivia and Angelica hit 120 with each other. They was like a perfect match. So they ended up getting to the ship. They ended up getting inside the ship, whatever. He needed Olivia, Angelica, and Marie for the ship. More or less, the two things he needed for the to for whatever his plan was to make it work was the saint and true love. True love, in this case, being Angelica and Olivia. So, um, more or less, in this time now, what I forgot to mention was Leon did in fact get his time with Marie. So they ended up talking, and they ended up finding out that they were siblings in their past lives. So um, Marie, now realizing who he is, who Leon is, she starts looking up to him in a sense, because she's like, "Can you save me? I don't want to die and whatnot. Save me from being executed." Now Leon being pissed, and he's like, "If I ever did see my sister from my past life, I swore I'd take my revenge on her for what she did to me." So more or less, um, they ended up finding out who each other was, and Marie wanted to take Leon from Olivia and Angelica. She told Olivia that she'd give her everything back, her position in the story and everything, but she just wants Leon. Knowing how capable Leon is from their past lives, it turns out that she relied on Leon a lot in their past life, and she realized it. Like, even though he had a foul mouth and whatnot, he was someone really important to her. He always took care of her and whatnot, so she wanted him back more or less. So they ended up, going to the war. What happened was, her truth after, she set everything up. That same armor piece that said that Leon had destroyed, um, she ended up acquiring another piece from the um, the treasury in the kingdom. She was making deals with Frampton, the Marquise, behind the scenes. So he ended up getting her to the vault, and she got um, the piece of the it was armor. It was the one of the arms. So she ended up getting that, and she sent it back to her people. So they got the piece, and they tried it with a whole bunch of people in the army, but it only really took with Vandal. Vandal being the guy that Leon fought at the end of Volume 2. Um, Vandal was the only one that was able to kind of control it in a sense. So they get back. Leon, more or less, he gets appointed to command in chief, and he exposes the Marquise for everything that he did, and in front of the king and queen. He plays back a video that Lux Leon took, and then he plays back all the evidence and whatnot. So Leon, now he sets up everything with the war that's going on. They capture the Marquise. He goes back to the school to recruit all the boys that remember from the last volume. He set it up where he was giving them airships, and he told them that he'll maintain them and whatnot. So he more or less had them sign a contract, but they more or less had to do what Leon said. So he set it up that way. So that was his forces, his group. So he got them together, and then he went back to his home, and he got his father on board with him to, go against the Thanos principality. So when he got there, he explained everything to the father about, Jenna's servant Miola setting him up and whatnot. So the father grabs Miola, and he drags him outside, and he sends Jenna more or less into her. They had a ship, so he sent her into her area on the ship, and just, he could drag Miola out, and before Miola could say anything, do anything, the father lopped his head off. Um, so now, when he got to his father and whatnot, they was more or less evacuating everybody in their territory, and we come to find, Zola, Leon's stepmother. She and her people were the last to, more or less get on. So she's demanding for the father to let her on, and the father's more or less saying that we're going to go fight the principality, and that he wants his oldest son, Rutart, being Zola's son, to, come with them, being that, Rutart has already graduated, and, he to come fight in the battle. So we find out from Zola that Rutart's not even his son. So being that that's not his son, and the Zola's children aren't his children, they actually have no relation to each other aside from, being married. So he's like, okay, well, he's not my son. I already pretty much figured as much, but now that you've confirmed it, um, bye. So he more or less left Zola and the family there, and he went with Leon and everybody else to go fight. Leon, Nyx, you know, they went off to go fight the Thanos Principality. So they go to fight. Um, More or less, Leon's side is more or less winning. Again, Leon has arrogance, and it's a pretty strong unit. And with the way he set up everything, things are going okay. But oh, one thing that I did forget to mention was the principality has a second princess, um, her true sister, her Trada. She more or less summoned two giant monsters, one in the sky and one in the sea. Um, Now, summoning those things, more or less, if you summon them, you will die. So she summoned the two of them. Um, Gertrude more or less goes back to the principality because Vandal came and got her. She got the flute back, and they left. They got back to the principality. Um, Now, like I said, everything's going on. They're fighting in the capital. Leon's side is more or less winning, but they still have some difficulties. So now at this point, Marie and them that's on the other ship, the Weiss, um, they come in and Marie using her saint powers and Olivia and Angelica using the power of love, they're able to amplify Olivia's power. This is what sets Olivia aside from Marie. Marie ended up taking her role as a saint, but what Leon was trying to get to, like, you took her Olivia's position, not even knowing what makes Olivia special. What makes Olivia special is her ability. Now, the ship more or less amplified her ability, and she's more or less able to get into people's minds, more or less. So, um, Olivia more or less starts going on and asking everybody to, just stop. We should stop fighting. Everybody, there's a lot of death and stuff going on. We should all just stop this ceaseless killing and whatnot. So everybody, it more or less affects everybody on both sides. So everybody starts throwing down their weapons, even Leon. It's more or less like a psychic attack, and Luxion keeps more or less warning Leon that this is what happens. So that's going down, and another thing I forgot to mention was that at this point, Luxion had separated from Leon in the sense that they were fighting in the capital, and Luxion was holding back the monster that was at the sea, the big one. Leon did mention that he couldn't beat it, but he wouldn't lose to the monster. The problem is that Luxion is strong enough to take on the monster, but the monster has an ability that it more or less it just keeps coming back. No matter how much you damage it, it just regenerates and keeps coming back. So Luxion, the main body, is fighting that, and Leon and them, they fighting the war up front. So after the whole thing with Olivia and whatnot, and everybody decided to, throw their weapons down, Vandal was the only one that wasn't affected by it because of the fragment that he had absorbed. It more or less kind of turned him into like a monster type thing. So it had no effect on him. So at this point in the story, Gertrude's sister, because of what happened with Olivia and them, she more or less lost her will to fight, and she more or less the monsters ended up fading away. So because they faded away, their whole directive was more or less completed. So because of that, Gertrude's sister ended up passing away. So Vandal asks Gertrude to, before her whole will to fight vanishes, to send him into battle so that he could, finish up what they started. So Gertrude more or less sends him into battle, and she's devastated at the loss of her sister and everything that's going on. She did end up finding out that um, Gertrude, by the way, she did end up finding out that what happened in the past with the whole principality and the kingdom, the whole full kingdom. It turns out that um, everything was more or less started by the principality, being that they was part of the kingdom at one point, but they more or less got greedy and they was trying to overthrow the king and whatnot. So they ended up becoming their own separate principality, more or less. So she found out the truth of what happened, and more or less, um, not only did she find out that, but more of the truth more or less came to her because one of the nobles on the ship that they was on more or less told her how much her and her sister were useless because after everything that they did, and they used them and more or less, and how they were the ones that killed their parents, because their parents wasn't with the idea of going against the principality and whatnot. So we find that everything was more or less a plot from their side. Not even they were being used by the nobles on their side, more or less. So she ends up figuring, after all of this, what did my sister die for? This was, there was no reason for her to die for these people. So Gertrude now ends up summoning the land monster because there's three: one for the land, one for the sky, one for the sea. The sister could summon the sky and the sea one, and Gertrude herself could summon the land one. So she more or less sets it upon everybody, on the battlefield because she lost her sister. So at this point, Vandal goes to attack Olivia, Marie, and Angelica because they're the source of, everything more or less dying down on the battlefield. So he attacks them. Leon and the five, the prince and others, they ended up protecting them. Um, the ship gets destroyed, so everything starts going back to the fighting and whatnot. Um, so at this point, the principality has more or less already lost, but they have to deal with Vandal and the land giant. So um, Leon ends up fighting Vandal, and at this point, Luxion ends up coming back because the sky and the sea giants, they got defeated. So Luxion comes back, and Leon's able to pull out a win over Vandal. Um, so after he won against Vandal, now they had to take care of the land giant. But like I said, summoning one of those things more or less sets you up to die because it more or less drains you of everything. So Marie came up with the idea that the best way to stop it is to have Gertrude more or less send it away. If she sends it away, it more or less stops the chances of her dying because it doesn't fulfill what it came out to do. So Angelica, Olivia, and Marie end up going to where Gertrude is, and they try to, persuade her to stop. Now, Olivia and them, more or less, they're trying to talk her down and telling her more or less that, it's not worth to go through all of this. But Marie ends up getting between them. She gets pissed off because of certain things that happened in her life. We find out before, with the whole Marie situation, we find out what happened to her and how she got reincarnated. Um, More or less, like I said before in a previous video, her life more or less after her brother died was really bad. Um, she was beaten to death by her boyfriend, and that's how she reincarnated. So with certain things that happened to Marie and everything, she kind of understood Gertrude's position, and by her sympathizing with Gertrude, whatnot, that was the key that set it off for Gertrude to just stop everything. Um, so they get through all of that, and then after all of this, the queen more or less explains everything that happened and why this happened. And it turns out the whole situation with the reason why females are more or less higher than men in their society. There's an actual reason for that. It's more or less to keep the nobles in check. It's to prevent them from gaining power and whatnot, because everything that happened was due to a noble, meaning the Thanos side. They ended up amassing power and going up against the kingdom. So the whole setup was to keep nobles low, and everything would go to the king and queen more or less. And by putting men on a lower branch that they couldn't gain power to go up against the whole full kingdom. That was the whole thing. So the queen explains all of that, and more or less Leon, after everything that's happened, he finally because everything's going up, and they more or less the kingdom got rid of all the nobles that more or less abandoned the kingdom and ran away, and they more or less boosted up everybody who helped them. So Leon finally explains that what he really just wants is for his titles to be taken away, and for him to more or less just live his life out peacefully. So he set that up to happen. Turns out that's not what happened. um, the king ends up boosting his rank to Earl. Now, Leon was pissed off, but it turns out the king, Julius's father, he was mad at Leon. Reason why he was mad at Leon was a dumb reason. More or less, before everything happened, when they was talking about the ship and trying to set up whatever, Leon kind of put himself in a position where he looked better than the king, and the king hated that. So Leon figured the reason why he hated him was because of the fact that he beat up his son and that he's been flirting with his wife every chance that he gets. But no, like I said, he doesn't care for the queen, and he's an idiot like his son, or I should say the son is an idiot like him. So he's pissed off at Leon because of that. So instead of stripping away his titles, he ends up granting him the title of an earl. So he boosted him up even further. So now Leon's put in that position where now a lot of girls will come to him for being that he's an earl now. He's just crawled his way up from a baron all the way to an earl, and in such a short time at that. So at this point, Angelica and Olivia more or less they confessed to him. They both told him how they feel, and that no matter what he chooses, they'll be fine with it between the two of them, or if somebody else even. They just wanted to hear how he felt. So he ends up more or less telling them that he loves them both, and they both slap him across his face. So, like I said, at this point, Leon, he has a few girls that's actually really interested in him. Two of those being Clarice and Deidre. But more or less, um, after everything's done and everything's set up, they set up something behind the scenes for Leon. More or less, they got him engaged to both Angelica and Olivia, and he didn't know. He thought this was something for his older brother Nix. So they set it up, and he gets there, and he more or less gets engaged to the two of them, Olivia and Angelica. So after he got engaged, um, he ended up finding out from Marie that there's actually more to the game. What happened was he only played the first game in the series. Now, after he beat the first game, remember he died right after. So they actually have a bunch of games in this series, and that they ended up clearing just the first game, and that there's the next game that happens, the second part, that is happening in another kingdom that he more or less has to go to. Leon ends up deciding to go there because he figured he doesn't want what happened with this game to happen in the second game, with how Marie messed up everything, and that seeing as how depending on what happens, it could actually be the end of the world. So he decides that after he got engaged to them, he ends up leaving for the Republic. Now, on his way to the Republic, he ends up finding this box on his ship, and in said box was Marie. More or less, the Queen and the King and everybody sent Marie and her group with him because more or less they're trouble more or less. um, After everything that they've done, they messed up everything more or less, and it was also a way to protect them because they got pardoned and Marie wasn't actually going to be executed anymore, but they're too much trouble to keep around, so they sent them off with Leon. So that's more or less how the third volume ends, with Leon moving on to the Republic and going to the next game. So, yeah, that was volume three. This volume was actually a lot thicker than the other volumes. It was about 100 pages more. But yeah, I like this volume. This one was pretty good. Next time I will be moving on to volume four, and we'll get back into it. See how Leon does in the Republic. But with that said, thank you again for watching. Hope to see you in the next video. Send me some comments. And join my Discord. Like I said, it'll be down there if you want to talk more on novels or manga or anime or anything, gaming, whatever. I'm down for it. We can game together. So yeah, just go to my Discord. You could join me there, and just subscribe and whatnot. And thank you again for watching. So I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.